Thank you for joining us for IPDay's Webinar Wednesday. I'm June Rolfe. Today's webinar, titled Interpreting Inferences from Textual Evidence, is facilitated by Bonnie Gooden and Susan Pittman. Do you find your students sometimes struggle to make inferences and draw conclusions that are based on evidence and reasoning? In today's webinar, Bonnie and Susan are going to provide you with several differentiated strategies along with instructional material for teaching inferences in a multi-level classroom. You should have already downloaded the PowerPoint and the resources that are associated with this webinar. If not, you can retrieve them off the IPDay website. Remember that all webinars are recorded and they are available for you to review. Throughout the webinar, you will also have the ability to ask questions or enter comments. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to enter those into the Q&A section that you see on your screen right now. This is an example, so this is where you go and you just hit the Q&A button and you ask Bonnie and Susan any questions that's on your mind. So enjoy today's webinar, and as always, stay connected with us. Our goal is to keep you informed of the latest developments and resources. Enjoy the webinar. Bonnie, Susan?
Thank you, June. As you saw, all of you are muted at this point, but again, as June said, if you have questions or comments as we go through today's webinar, please feel free to put it in the question and answer or in the chat box, and we will be checking it throughout. So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to talk about different types of inferences, both in fiction and in nonfiction. And we're going to talk about some strategies that you can take back to your classroom right away. And of course, as always, Susan and I are going to share a lot of resources and ideas. But Susan, what does it mean? We've used this word quite a bit already. What's it mean to infer?
Well, you know, I think about that word and I think about it from our students' perspective. And quite often, they're kind of at a loss as to what that means. Now, especially if we ask them to do it whenever we have something that's in print. However, those same students are the ones who can talk with someone, and by watching what they're doing and their body language and their eyes, they can see, oh, that wasn't exactly what you meant. They make inferences every day, but they don't think about it in terms of doing that same thing when they're back over and reading and trying to interpret different materials. Because really, what does it mean to infer? It means that we're going to kind of read between the lines. We're going to take information that's provided and other things that we know, and we're going to put them together to kind of create something new. Bonnie, I think you've got a cartoon that maybe kind of brings some of that to being for us.
You know, I think you're right. And since you were talking about eyes just a little bit ago, good Snoopy says, "Your eyes are beautiful," he said. "Shall I compare them to a summer day? No, even more. Your eyes are like two supper dishes." You know, I don't know that that was a real flattering comment about whoever Snoopy was writing to. But we could make an inference here that to Snoopy, there's something as wonderful as supper. And so he really did mean it as a compliment. But I think it goes even further, because when we look at the GED test and we look at what it assesses, one of the things that the GED test assesses is whether our students can identify an underlying premise or assumption in an argument and evaluate the logical support and evidence provided. But Susan, we've got another cartoon here. Can you make some inferences? Can you make some assumptions from this cartoon?
Well, let's see. If I just take a general look at it, and I just kind of look at it just first off, I see I'm at a pet store, and, you know, I've got a bird of some kind, and I've got a cat, and I've got the fish. But, you know, as I look closer at that, I see that that cat, those front paws on that cat are not quite right. And in fact, that kind of looks like peg legs to me. And that reminds me of, oh, pirates? Okay, so it's like something happened to this cat. Well, then as I'm looking through, I'm thinking about the cat, and I go, cats, yeah, they would really be fascinated by fish. But Bonnie, I guarantee you, that cat really regrets having taken a little closer look at that one fish that's over there, because I see it says it's a piranha. So what can I infer? That cat should not have stuck his paws in that particular fish bowl.
You are so correct. And when we're looking at inferences and we're looking at those indicators from GED Testing Service, we do know that we need to look for certain things in our students' work. We need to make sure that all of our students can identify explicit premises and assumptions that come from an argument in a text. But we also need to make sure that they can identify implicit premises and assumptions. A little bit different, a little more complex. And of course, we can't forget that sometimes an inference refers to what the author has as a bias or assumptions that we can look at in a text. And of course, we want students to be able to make judgments, informed judgments on whether those premises or assumptions are justified. But you know what, Susan? It's not just in RLA, is it?
No, those are the same kinds of things that you're going to see in other areas. We may be looking at those implicit and explicit premises, but, we have to look at the fact that social studies, and especially those primary sources, do a lot of that where students have to make those logical inferences based on what they've read. They've got to come to those assumptions. And the same thing happens when you get over a more technical text and we start talking about evidence that we might need in science. So both of those things, it kind of all flows together because, Bonnie, we're going to see inferences on this test in all different areas. I mean, granted, they're definitely on those constructed responses, whether it's the one that you see in RLA and it's the extended response or it's in science. But, all those technology enhanced items that we see that refer to not just fiction but nonfiction text, we have to do inferences there. And I think one other area maybe that we haven't focused on as much in the past is we really need to look at what can we infer based on what we see within different types of graphics, photographs and graphs and charts and tables and drawings. What inferences can we make from those? So really, this goes across the board when it comes to the GED test.
So, what exactly is an inference or inferring? Zweers gives us an overview is that it's often described as making a logical guess, or I know I used to tell my students it's like reading between the lines. But of course, they didn't always understand what that really meant. And Zweers says, it's like the chemical process where we form a chemical compound where you've got two separate elements and they combine and they form this new substance. And we do know that readers make inferences, and oftentimes they make inferences based upon their own experiences. And when they can combine those with the information they gather from what they read, what we hope is that they not only have new meaning, but that they have an accurate type of inference that they're making. Because Margaret Atwood tells us that the answers you get from reading depend upon the questions you pose. And I think, Susan, a little bit later in this broadcast, we're going to talk about what are some specific questions that you should pose. But I think there's a whole lot of other things. Susan, schema, is that a new word?
Well, no, it's not a new word. It's just, how we have to have the technical word. But that's really more going back to what is our background knowledge? What is it we already know? What do we bring to the table ourselves? Because anytime that we're interacting with text, we do have that sitting in the background. We have this knowledge that we can use to help us as we're working through text. Because that background knowledge can help us make connections. It can have us make predictions. Think about the fact that from that background knowledge and what all we're doing, if we're going to arrive at an inference, we do some questioning. And it's not just read the text and try to figure out those words, but all those other pieces that are in there. And I think another part of this, and maybe one that our students need some help with, is taking text and visualizing what it's saying. And that is something that so many of us as effective readers, we do on an ongoing basis. We don't think about it. We see these kind of pictures in our head, and that helps us with making inference. But for our students, it's a little different. So I think, Bonnie, as we go through this, we need to talk a little bit about that visualization and maybe some strategies that can help students as they're working through that. But you know, Bonnie, there are some things here, though. Our students, they're, you know, if you think about it, for many of our students, are quite literal. And so they look for an answer that's just right there on the page. And inference requires that you go beyond that. And it's a higher order thinking skill. And it does mean that we go back and we take that background knowledge. And maybe for some of our students, they just don't have as much background knowledge. Because, Bonnie, you know, the more you read, the more you know. And for many of our students who are reluctant readers at best, they really aren't delving into a lot of text because they just don't understand how to get beyond just the words that are on the page.
You know, that's so true, because if our students aren't able to use not only those word or text clues, but also picture clues, and if they don't know how to define unknown words or look for emotion or feelings, you know what? A good person who infers, a good reader also, as you said, use what they already know. They look for those explanations, and you're right, they do ask themselves a lot of questions as they go through. They are not literal readers. So, how do we make inferences? We combine those clues, we draw from experience, and we make that logical conclusion. But Susan, let's go ahead and talk about a few strategies, because that's what we all need in our classrooms, are strategies. And what we're going to share with you today are strategies that you can use at all levels of adult ed. Because bottom line, if our students don't start making inferences at that lowest readability level, if they don't employ good, strong strategies, they're going to have a very difficult time when they get into more complex text, complex graphics, because a good strategy is really a good strategy. So we should be able to help all levels of students gather clues and read between those lines, and we should be able to help them reach conclusions based on evidence and reasoning. Does it make sense? But oftentimes, Susan and I see, as we are working with inference, that we start at those things on the right, those longer, more intricate passages, both in fiction and nonfiction, instead of helping our students make inferences at a simpler level by looking at pictures, advertisements. That should be the first step, the first type of resource each and every one of us use in our classroom. If we teach the strategy there and move towards those longer, more intricate passages, going through from the pictures, advertisements to the comics. Wow, comics, I can think editorial cartoons. Going into, again, script or text, which is at the sentence level, then the short paragraphs, and then both fiction and nonfiction. Our students really will be much more able to find that making inferences is not that difficult. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you some strategies, and we are together, Susan and I, going to work from the simple to the complex. And what we're going to start out with is asking questions. It should be just something very natural to each and every one of us as an instructor, that as students look at photographs or comics, or as they read text, we should ask them certain questions and make it natural, so that as they're reading, they're asking themselves the same questions. Now, you have some of these items in your workbook, but for today, for this session, Susan and I are going to work through these questions as we look at different photographs. And Susan, for a bit, is going to act as my student, and I'm going to ask her these items like you would ask any of your students in the classroom. So as we go into the next segments, take a look very quickly at these questions. What do I see? We want students to truly see. This is really hard for those of us instructors because we want to see it and immediately go into what it reminds us of or that inference that it makes. But we want our students to just look and truly, what exactly do you see? Next step is to activate that schema or background knowledge. What does that remind you of? Once we're there, then what's that author's purpose? Is it to analyze, persuade, express, document, entertain? And then finally, or as oftentimes we laughingly say, in conclusion, so what? We don't make the inference until then. So here's how it works. Susan, here's a photograph that I want you to take a look at. And I want you to share with us, what do you see in this picture?
Well, the first thing I see is I see the word bell, which reminds me, and I know that's next, but that's a telephone booth, you know, kind of a different looking telephone booth than what we're used to. But boy, it sure looks old, all scratched up and dented and the paint's coming off of it. But I also see a young woman, and in her hand, she's got looks like a smartphone. But looks like it must be a cold day there because, boy, she's wrapped up. She's got, you know, a scarf on. She's got a jacket. Maybe she's a student, or maybe she's just walking back from work because I see something. I see a strap. Looks like a backpack. But I also see that, what is she doing with that phone? Well, it looks like she's got that thumb poised there. So I have a feeling that, you know, it looks like she's texting.
You know, Susan, you are so brilliant, but you immediately went from what you saw to what you inferred a couple times here. And as we work with students, we want to make sure that first they see. Susan already inferred that it was cold out. How? Because she saw that this person was wearing warm clothes. She was wearing a heavy jacket. She wore something around her neck. She inferred that this young woman was texting. How? Because she saw the thumb on the phone. When you work with students, keep taking them back to not what are you inferring or what does it remind you of, but again, initially back to all I want you to do is what you see. Susan, you did a great job. So I'm going to go the next step, and that is, what do these things remind you of?
Well, the old booth reminds me of something you don't see anymore, which are those payphones that are out there. And, you know, looking at the girl, what does that remind me of? People everywhere kind of with their heads down and walking around. That's the kind of thing that, you know, I mean, especially as I begin to see that, it's like kind of this, you know, crazy disconnect, or maybe I shouldn't say disconnect, but it's this crazy thing like it's the past and now.
Oh, and we already have gone through a few wonderful things, and what it reminds her of is she put some of her own background knowledge. What do you think the photographer's purpose is? Do you think it's to analyze or persuade or express or entertain or document, or what do you think?
Actually, I think it's kind of to document, and I think it's documenting just that that change that we've seen from the old to the new.
Okay, so can you make a couple inferences? You already have made the inference that it's cold outside. What would be some other inferences that you would make based upon what you see in this picture?
Well, I can infer that, you know, things are much easier because of the technology. You know, I can keep in motion, and, you know, I'm also looking at this woman as she's looking down at this and thinking, you know, there she is just moving along, taking care of whatever business she's got to take care of, and doesn't have to stop and stand there at a payphone.
Oh, definitely. We were at a workshop not too long ago where a gentleman said, he inferred that today's technology isolated the universe as folks were not communicating in the same way without their voices. And you think, wow, that's a long way to go with inferences. But he really was bringing so much of his own background knowledge. What you want to do with questions is start with something students are familiar with, these types of photographs, because where we want to head is something like this, a more historic photograph. So Susan, you want to quickly take us through what do you observe in this picture?
Well, let's see. I see 5 people. Looks like all females. I see a rocking chair.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of an interesting rocking chair. I see a trunk, and it's open, and there's some things kind of sticking out of it. I see a tarp, or, not quite a tent, but a tarp of some kind. I see the rope coming out from that. I see some empty bottles or some kind of containers over there on the left-hand side. The ground is really rocky, and it looks dry because I don't see mud puddles. I just kind of see sandy dirt, and I see trees in the background. I see a road. It looks like a road back there, but it doesn't. It looks like a dirt road somewhere.
That's great. And what I see here too is it's a black and white photo. And I see those faces where I don't see smiles on the older people at all. There's something I don't see. I don't see men in this picture. What does it remind you of?
Well, this reminds me of a couple of things. One, it reminds me of photographs I've seen in the past of like during the Dust Bowl or, during the Depression. But it also reminds me of something I've seen more recently, not too long ago when I was in California and I saw some homeless camps. And, kind of thrown together. It kind of looks like that, but also, it looks like maybe hygiene's not the greatest in the possibilities here, so kind of dirty faces and hands, especially of the children.
Oh, definitely. It reminds me of all the things I read about the Great Depression and that novel, The Grapes of Wrath. So what do we think the photographer's purpose is here?
I think it's to document that point in time of just how severe the conditions were in which people were living.
And can you make at least one inference about the picture from what you've seen?
Well, going back to you made a comment about the faces and how sad they look. But they look more than that. It looks like there's hunger there as well. It's a kind of this desperation, and with the bottles that are there, the containers that are empty, I'm going to infer here that possibly the men have gone to try to find food or find work or something to help feed and take care of their families.
Definitely, and that's a great route to go inference. What Susan and I have found with our students in the past is this is where oftentimes they start with inferences, and our students don't have the knowledge base. They don't see things first. And so when they're asked to infer, they have no clue where to start. So the first step is using photographs. What we have here are a couple advertisements. And so the same thing should happen here. What do you see? What does it remind you of? What's the photographer's purpose? And what inferences can you make? Now, this will date Susan and me because we remember Morton Salt. And we've worked with some younger instructors who have said, what is that? So as you work with advertisements, you may want to look at your students and determine what is best for your age group, because maybe it's not Morton salt, maybe it's something like this. Susan, you think this would be better for some of our younger students?
I think they could relate to that one a little bit better in terms of, the difference between a PC and a Mac. And also to be able to really discuss within this the fact that, what the purpose is behind this. And it really is to sell a product. And how do you do that? By taking one and making it kind of look broken down and problematic. And of course, I have to say this morning as I turned on my computer, it actually had to do a whole bunch of updates and fixes because something wasn't working with my PC. But, it kind of, for me today, it is kind of timely. But I think that this one probably would be easier for students to relate to rather than the other one. However, the other one would pose some things that would draw on them to do that higher order thinking.
Oh, definitely. But here again, what you want your students to do is first, what do they see? And so we should have students who are talking about they see a younger person, they see that younger person and the way that person's dressed. They see the other person, they see the wheelchair, they see, all the types of things, even that facial expression. They see a facial expression of grimaces, etc., and they see the words. So we've gone from photos to advertisements, and you know what? Cartoons are also wonderful. And we've got a couple for you to use in the classroom. The first one is just one that we took out of the newspaper on good old Garfield. And with Garfield, before we leave, Susan, we have a chat. One of my students said the PC has more problems, breaks more often than the Mac. The Mac's for the new thinkers, the PC for the older sets. That comes from Lynn, and what a great inference. Definitely. So back to Garfield. Again, you're going to want to ask the same questions. What do you see? Why do you think John thinks he knows where the cheese puffs went? Why does John ask Garfield to show him his paws? What does Garfield mean when he says the perfect crime? And they should get the fact that good old Garfield has orange paws, and guess what? Anytime I've eaten cheese puffs, my hands have ended up orange as well. But Susan, let's go ahead and deconstruct, so to speak, this particular cartoon. So I'm going to ask you, with this cartoon, what do you see?
Okay, I see an open door and it says culinary school. I see two people standing there. I see a chef on the left side with his arms crossed and a kind of scowl on his face. I see another, has a chef's hat in his hand, and he has his eyes kind of got that pleading look. So those are the things I see. Plus, I see the words, "I ate my homework."
What do you know about excuses about not having your homework done?
Well, I think there's not a person out there today who couldn't tell us 1,000,001 different excuses, from I left it in the car to my dog ate it, which, used to be the funny one that they always talked about. But I think when we take a look at this one, when we talk about the student, the one with chef's hat in hand, saying, "I ate my homework," it's literally, I ate my homework. And I can see that the teaching chef is not real happy about the process, the proposition.
Susan, does that mean he ate he ate paper?
Oh, no. That means that student cooked something and it must have been really good because he ate it all.
Yes, and Lynn responded.
And I think that's one thing that Lynn says, the same thing, that he was tempted to eat it before he could even hand it in. I mean, he obviously knows good food when he sees it. Lynn, you are absolutely correct, because this student, I don't think, has missed any meals.
No, I don't think so either. But from those types of cartoons, we can move to editorial. editorial cartoons, which there are still editorial cartoons on the GED test. So Susan's my history major, so she can infer a lot of things from this cartoon. But before I let her infer, what I see is I see women, and I see they have sashes, and it looks like they have long skirts. I see that on that sash at the front, it says the West, and I see that that person looks like she's driving this big thing, which, if I look underneath, I see the word steamroller. And I see that that steamroller has the word progress, but that steamroller is just crushing these rocks, and I see that those rocks have the word opposition on it. So as I see all this, I'm pretty sure that this particular artist is trying to either inform or persuade. I'm not quite sure yet. I need to go that next step. But Susan, I know you know a lot about history, so what does this remind you of?
Well, it actually reminds me about the women's movement in order to get the right to vote. That, you know, there was a long, hard battle fought in order for women to get the right to vote. But that battle brought the right to vote to women in the East at the very end with the 19th Amendment, because the women in the West, they actually had that right to vote before there was a 19th Amendment, because as that westward expansion was going on, women were voting. Women had more rights as they went through. So this shows that women led the women from the West, they led that progress against all that opposition to having the right to vote.
So you've put some of that background knowledge straight into some inferences. So go further. What do you think this author was trying to do, this cartoonist, and what are a couple of inferences we can make?
Well, within this one, I think really that they're showing the documentation of how the progress was made toward the women's right to vote, and that was with the women from the West that were starting that, pushing that progress, which being the steamroller, over the opposition that was out there. And, you know, I think, you know, what we can infer from that is that women set the pace. Women in the West really set the pace for getting that movement going. And then we had all of the women who fought so hard for the right that hopefully all of us exercised yesterday.
You know, Susan, without going through these questions, my students would have looked at this and without really, first of all, seeing and then going through those other questions, they would have just seen there were women driving this big machine that's crushing rocks. They wouldn't get the rest of the stuff. They wouldn't see those sashes. They wouldn't see those other things. So this particular strategy of questioning is so very important. But we have another little editorial cartoon that I think we can teach a whole lot of symbolism, et cetera, with this one. So you want to take it away for us?
Well, as we go through, and I know that we have limited time in going through this, but I think what we have to do with this is that, again, it comes back, as Bonnie has said before, making sure that students are seeing what all is included in each one of the cartoons. And what we can see is we see a symbol here, which is that donkey. And our students need that ability to recognize those symbols as then we're into the Democratic Party. And then, of course, that donkey saying getting awful crowded. Well, there are not a lot of people here, but I do see a person who's got his hat in his hand. And underneath this, I see a whole bunch of other hats that are there representing other people. But if I look closely enough, I see one other thing, and I notice that there's actually a ring around this, which, you know, kind of a saying of tossing your hat in the ring. And of course, that hat is going in with a whole bunch of other people. So talking about a crowded field for people who were looking for this particular election.
And we have a question from Loretta who says, do the political cartoons assume that students are familiar with the enduring issues? And yes, our students need to continue to have the knowledge of enduring issues. Susan and I have often worked with, those first 10 amendments and some of those major ideas, but they do need to understand the big ideas of enduring issues and how those enduring issues have continued over time. So that's a great question. They did not go away just because there is no longer an extended response. Okay, we went from those items. So now it's time for that next step, and it's called trying to make inferences in fiction. Because if we look at this question from the item sampler, it says in the excerpt, Anne asked Marilla to call her Cordelia. What does this request reveal about Anne? Susan and I are going to tell you that nowhere in this text does it have these specific words that she wants to make her life more interesting, or wishes she could fit in better with her peers, or she feels confused, or she hesitates to share personal details. They must take a look at Anne's character, and they need to infer what she actually meant by this request. So we really need to work with students on some characterizations. I hate to always use the word character analysis because that scares all of us. We'll say, oh my goodness, they have to go through this whole big thing. No, but they do need to, when they're reading fiction text, they need to, when they're asked about a character, know some of the facts and the actions and what the character says and what the character shares that he or she feels. But oftentimes it's about visualization, as Susan said earlier. Susan, do you see people in your mind when you read a book?
Always. I've always given them, there's a character that's there. It's like a movie that runs in my head.
Yeah. It does in mine too. In fact, when we ask folks, would you rather see the movie or read the book first? We oftentimes have a mixture. With educators, often we have quite a few of you who would rather first read the book because you don't want the movie messing it up of what you think somebody should look like. You think books are more expansive, etc. But we also have folks who would rather see the movie. And there's a lot of reasons. They'd like to be able to immediately have that visualization. They like to have that flow of the plot. But regardless, all of our students need to be able to visualize in fiction. So Susan and I have provided for you in your workbook, and we'll show you at the end of this broadcast, a short story called Broken Promises. And the way we've used it with students is having them read this short story about a wife and a husband, the husband wanting a boat, and the wife saying no, and both of them say we can't afford it, and they have a very, I'd say almost a life-changing experience when they go into a store. And so as you have your students read that the first time and you ask them some questions like what does the character do, etc., they may give you some ideas. But what we'd like you to try with this story when you go back to the classroom is tell the students after they've read that story, put them in small groups and say, you know what? Broken Promises is now a screenplay, and you are the casting directors for this screenplay. So please, for us, cast the husband, the wife, and any other characters. It's a great activity. And what happens is as students are casting these important characters, they're thinking about reasons why they cast someone. I'm going to tell you that for the husband, we've heard the casting, such folks as Walter Matthau and Archie Bunker, and you probably already, if I say those two names, get in your mind, boy, this is a grumpy old guy. And yes, you do. But it's interesting because then if you have students read it again, all of a sudden they have a better understanding of how that plot works, how the theme works, and just as importantly, what those characters have for characteristics they have truly analyzed. And Susan, we've had a whole lot of fun with that one, haven't we?
Oh, we have. And some of the characterizations and the casting that different teachers have done, and then what their students have done when they went back into the classroom are really interesting. And it's always one of those of watching across the group going, oh, yeah, I could see that person doing that. I recognize that one. Yes, that's perfect. That's the perfect person to play that character. So they're doing all the things that you would see in doing a character analysis and using some stuffy graphic organizer, but they're having fun with it. And all of those things are there because as the students work through this part, the other thing that you can ask is, as they've made those castings, you can say, well, what evidence in that text that you read really pointed you to this type of person or this character playing this? And so you get that information, but you're just doing it in a way that it's a lot more fun. And I think in the long run, it really appeals to students, but gets them to think deeper than they actually would otherwise.
So true. The only thing, Susan, I have found is dependent upon the age of some of our instructors or students. Once in a while, we have to say, who is that? Because I'm not aware of all the younger actors out there. And for Robert, this presentation is going to be posted later. It will be archived as a webinar, but also the PowerPoint slides as well as the workbook will be posted on IP Day too. So great questions. Okay, Susan, we're up through fiction. So I guess it's time for nonfiction. And this is an example of a science question. And if you look at the indicator, it says that as the student writes the short answer, he or she is supposed to cite textual evidence to support inferences. Again, it's that I word. So we do see nonfiction having inferences. And it's not just science, it's also social studies. This is a great passage as we were talking about enduring issues, don't you think?
Well, it does, because it gives you an opportunity to do a few different things as you're working with it. One is to really kind of assess whether or not students have an understanding of the separation of powers, but also what powers each one of those three branches of government actually has. So this one allows you to do a couple of things, but also to really get a good feel for what students would be encountering with a question such as this, and the kinds of inferences that they would have to make. One thing that we have found, and there's a great graphic organizer that you can use to help students with this, is it's called It Says, I Say, and So. And if we take a look, it's really about having students look at the question, then look to the text, look to that source text to see what information would help to answer that question. And then taking that and thinking about what remember that word schema we use, that background knowledge, you do know about it, and then putting the two together. And as you can see from this one, we have a really good one here. You know, like, why are forest fires on the increase in the Black Hills of South Dakota? Well, if the student read the text, the student would find that, you know, the last several years, the precipitation amounts, the snowfall has decreased. Okay, now, as a person, you know, just in everyday life, I know that if I have less precipitation, then that means things are going to be a lot drier. And since I'm sitting here in North Carolina, we are actually in the middle of a drought up in western North Carolina right now. So this is a very serious issue with a number of different forest fires in this general area. So I know that, you know, less snowfall means drier conditions. Well, if I take those two things and I put it together, then those dry conditions are the result of a decrease in the precipitation, which I learned from the text. And I know that that's something that could set up the conditions that would be likely for fires to occur. So I've taken my personal knowledge, I've taken what the text has told me, and I've created that last meaning.
You know, this is a great one also for fiction. If we think back to the Anne of Green Gables, and it's asking about what she thinks, the student can go into that text, find where Anne is saying that. So it says, pull in their own background knowledge, I say, and then put it together. And so it works for both fiction and nonfiction. But this comes back to that question we saw before that Susan talked about in social studies. And so if the question is, what did the court want to prevent? It says in that text that this is a job for the nation's lawmakers, not for its military authorities. Now, I know that the Constitution shows that separation of power within the three branches of government, and I know, or I say, that each branch has its own job to do. And so I can infer that the court wanted to make sure that the president, who is that military leader, that commander-in-chief, did not interfere with the rights of the legislative branch in doing their job. And from there, I can determine which answer is correct. A great strategy for all different types of areas. But one last thing, and one last strategy, because we've talked about questioning strategies, we've talked about actually character analysis by visualization, we've talked about it says, I say, and so. Another one is we need to think to ourselves what happens when we read. And I guarantee as you look at this slide, it makes a lot of sense to most of us because as effective readers, we have that inside voice. That inside voice, as we're reading text, makes guesses automatically, makes connections. And as we're reading, we ask questions. Gee, what do I think will happen next? Why do I think? Gee, I'm wondering if. We also make predictions. I think that at the end of this crime novel, it will indeed be so-and-so who did it because. We also, again, use that schema. We personalize it. This is just so much like. In fact, I guarantee when you read Broken Promises, that short story, you will think very personally about it. And then, of course, we use our background knowledge, and that comes out of some research from Zimmerman and Hutchins in 2013, but it's something that I think is real common sense to all of us. So what we've also provided for you are a couple short articles. And you'll notice that when we start with some of these strategies, we do not start with pages upon pages upon pages. This particular article could be used at all different levels. It is not written at a very high readability level, and it's about something that many of our students will know something about, especially if they are baby boomers or probably even Gen Xers. It was a song called We Are the World, and that will connect with many folks. So as they're reading through it, there will be a connection piece. But we want to, again, teach them how to ask themselves those internal questions. If we look at the title, and I'm going to go back to that slide, and then I'm going to ask the question so you can see what we're talking about. My internal questions could be something like, what does that title tell me? Susan, what does rallying power mean to you?
It means that I can get a lot of people around me. I'm rallying them around me. I'm bringing in people.
And we did talk a little bit about some background knowledge. I can remember, seeing that song being sung and all of those, wonderful artists who were on stage. Also, as I read through that, I have to think to myself, what message does this author want me to understand? And it looks like this author's telling me that it was the fastest climbing record of the decade, and all of these copies were sold, but it's also telling me about the profits, that these were folks who volunteered, and those profits went to a wonderful project in Africa. And a song could save lives. That would be something my students might have said, oh, wow, a song saved lives. Well, it was the funding that song created that did that. But again, as I look through it and then I see some other songs that I know well, what a great short article to build my internal questions on. But as an instructor, we're not done yet. We also want to make sure that as our students are reading, that we as instructors provide questions that they answer, whether they can infer them or not from what they've read. And at the beginning levels, we need to do this for students, putting these types of statements there and having them say, yes, I could infer this from the article, or no, I cannot. And even more importantly, why? And as Susan and I said earlier, you will have all of these items, and we'll show you in just a moment in your workbook as we go through. Susan, anything else you want to say about that? Because I know we want just a couple minutes at the end to have some questions.
Well, I think that the last thing is that we really want students to make sure that they pay attention to the facts that are in front of them from what they read themselves. You know, we want to make sure that our students recognize that they do have background knowledge. You know, sometimes they don't give themselves as much credit as they deserve, but, you know, helping them understand how to access that and recognize that and then be able to practice that is going to make a difference. And, you know, as we're going through, the other thing is students have to see that, you know, we can infer lots of different things from a photograph or from what we've read, and so it's not about jumping to that first conclusion, but rather that we look at different alternatives that are there. So I think with those three things in mind, the last thing, it just comes down to practice. The more that we can involve our students and do these types of things, the more students are going to learn, the more background information they gain. And, you know, it's that cycle, and it's just going to help them build their knowledge.
So correct. So let's take a quick look, because I know if you're like Susan and me, unless we see what we're needing to access, sometimes we don't go back and do it. So when you get back, if you've not already downloaded both the PowerPoint and the guide, this is the guide with a few tools from Susan and me for you in the classroom. The first thing you have are those questions that we use today, asking questions of the photographs. And you'll see that we do have a thing for answers. Susan, I would strongly recommend that you use the gradual release model, that first of all, you talk through things for students to see how you dissect those photographs. They then do it with you. They then do it with small groups. And finally, that they're able to do it themselves, either writing down some ideas or, again, sharing it to answer questions. We've also provided you with a more complex cartoon analysis worksheet. Again, it's got more questions for students to really more deeply analyze a cartoon. Susan and I would start at the ABE ESOL level with the questions that we used in the PowerPoint. But at a GED prep level, students should be able to answer these questions, and you'll notice that it does come from the National Archives. Broken Promises is a short story that Susan and I found a number of years ago. And no, you probably don't know the name Lorraine Grigori. She is a lady like you and me who wrote short stories and put them on a site called Story Bites, which, although it continues to be up, they are no longer accepting short stories. What Susan and I really liked about this short story was readability was good. It truly was short enough to use in a classroom, because let's face it, sometimes short stories, such as some of the stories by Poe, who is supposed to be the short story king, are long stories, very lengthy. But also it has a lot of connection pieces to today's world. And you have a casting sheet. So you can actually give students their casting sheet where they name their characters, they identify the traits, and of course they provide the casting choice. Again, these are questions that you saw on the PowerPoint, on the presentation, and what we've done is provided them in a handout that you can use in your classroom with your students for short stories. And of course, the It Says, I Say, and So graphic organizer. And then, as we promised, that short paragraph or 2 paragraphs on the rallying power with questions, and just a couple other strategies. Many of you may know questioning the author. Again, different types of questions. Let's face it, we can't infer unless we ask ourselves lots of questions. Same way with the making text connections. And last but not least, a few resources. Susan, any of them here that you'd like to quickly point out to folks?
I think the main one would be that we haven't mentioned very often is isit.org, so that you can get a variety of articles from different sources. We've talked quite a bit about Newsela as being a place to go. Take a look at awesome stories. Those are things too that you can use working with students. And always, if you look at the National Archives and you go into the Library of Congress, you can find just pretty much any type of photograph, editorial cartoon. You can find so many of those different things.
And if you need very easy stories, the reading skills for today's adults are written from a 0.7 to an 8.9 grade equivalents from Marshall Adult Ed, written by adult ed instructors, and you do again have the story bites there. One of the things, Susan, I would strongly recommend before you use some of the materials is, of course, to read them carefully to make sure that they are appropriate for your adult education audience. So having said that, Susan, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint for just a few moments. And as we go to some resources, let's go ahead and see if we have any questions.
Looks like they're awfully quiet out there, Bonnie.
Oh, it sure does. You know, oftentimes folks will say, do you have actual lesson plans? And yes, if you go to Florida IP Day under the GED and ABE lesson plan areas, you'll notice we've highlighted 3 of them that do deal with inferencing. There's themes and short stories. Boy, that's a big inferencing issue. Determining meaning and making inferences, and interpreting photographs, first step in understanding text. All 3 of those focus on making inferences in different types of text. And of course, don't forget in the GED Prep e-training modules, there are a number of slides and strategies there that also talk about making inferences. And as we go into this year's workshops, happening now, we are finishing up our GED Prep Train the Trainer workshops in RLA and Math. If you have not attended, please do so. You're going to go away with great materials, all scripted and ready for you to share with your fellow teachers, administrators. Grab and Goes continue to be placed on the IP Day website. Great new format. Our webmaster, Joseph, who's with us always in our webinars, is just really doing some creative things there. And of course, we're sure that you are part of Webinar Wednesdays. As we go forward, we are going to have some ABE instructional and differentiated workshops coming up after the first of the year, and science and math will be out for the GED. So that's what's here and what's coming, and we have just a couple more minutes if anyone has questions, comments, etc. Well, Susan, it looks like everyone is quiet. On behalf of June, Susan, and myself, we thank you so much for being with us. Please know that the IP Day team is always here to assist. We look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to seeing you at another webinar. So, Susan, any final words?
Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you in the new year.
Yes. And how about you, June?
No, thank you for participating today, and stay tuned for the next webinar coming up next Wednesday.
Okay, make sure that you access the archived webinars, and please have a wonderful day.